I stood at the kitchen sink, turning over my hands in the light, the ridges of age and memory all but written in my skin. It's funny what you notice on a quiet morning when the house is still. My name is Evelyn Carter. I'm 73, and there's not much. These hands haven't done. They've cradled babies, wiped away tears, and carried casseroles into church basements. I never expected those same hands would become a point of judgment for my own children. But that's where this story begins. Before I go any further, let me know where you're listening from in the comments. And if you've ever felt invisible in your own home, go ahead and hit that like and subscribe button. I was born Evelyn Sanders just outside Springfield, Missouri, in a house that still stands at the edge of what used to be cornfields. My mother kept the place spotless, and my father worked for the railroad. Neither of them ever saw a dime. They didn't earn. We didn't have much growing up, but what we did have was ours, and it mattered. My brother and I were taught to respect our elders, work for what we wanted, and never turn our noses up at hard-luck neighbors. When I was 19, I met Tom Carter. He had the kind of smile that could light up a gloomy afternoon, and hands just as rough as mine from working construction. We married young, had 2 children, Arthur and Willow, and settled down in Jefferson City. Tom was steady as a stone, kind to the bone, never missed a Sunday at church. He passed too soon, heart attack in his sleep. At 41, I was left with a house, 2 teenagers, and a stack of bills. I had no business tackling. Folks in town remembered the casseroles I'd dropped off when their own families fell on hard times, so they started asking if I'd cook for them too. At first, it was chicken salad and apple cobbler for neighbors. But by winter, I was making lunches for half a dozen families and delivering them before dawn. Willow hated the whole thing, hated the old beat-up wagon we drove. Hated that. Her friends saw her carrying containers across front porches. Arthur helped when he could, but he always looked for the door as soon as the work was done. After 2 years of dawn deliveries and penny pinching, I signed my first real contract with the county hospital. It was a turning point that nobody in our family saw coming. I put every spare dollar back into the business. Every success seemed to drive a little more distance between me and the kids, especially as they got older. Arthur headed off to Chicago to chase a finance career. Willow stayed closer to home, married Randall, and started a family of her own. Now I sit in a house built from the ground up with money earned the long way and a business that keeps 3 kitchens humming every morning. Arthur's back in town, and Willow's working in marketing. Though, if I'm honest, most days I see more of their names on the payroll than I see their faces in the office. I never thought, after everything we'd weathered, that my own children would be the ones to question whether I still belonged in the life I'd built. But it started the day they brought me a gold watch for my 73rd birthday. A room full of applause and well-meaning smiles, Willow raising her glass, telling me it was time to step back and enjoy my golden years. I smiled and thanked her, but something cold crept in behind my ribs. I could see it in the way Arthur and Willow looked at each other, in the hush that settled after the speeches, as if the next chapter had already been written, just not by me. That's when I realized I was standing on the edge of a story I never meant to live but couldn't avoid. Not with my name on the front door and the echo of Tom's voice telling me not to give up before the work was finished. And that's where I'll leave it for now. Tomorrow's board meeting might decide more than the future of the business. It might decide what family means after all these years. The gold watch sat heavy on my wrist, its band still cold from the box, as if it hadn't quite decided it belonged there. The birthday cake was already sliced, and most of the staff had drifted back to their desks, but Willow lingered at my side with her hand on my arm. Arthur stood in the background watching us, his expression polite and unreadable. I caught a glimpse of my own reflection in the office glass, neat suit, silver hair, a woman who looked exactly the way her children expected her to look, capable enough to run a company, but not so stubborn as to overstay her welcome. Willow leaned in close, her voice pitched low, just for me. You deserve some rest, Mom. Take that trip you always talked about. Let the younger folks handle the long hours for a while. I nodded, thanked her, and kept my smile steady. But there was a flicker of something I couldn't name, a chill that settled in my chest and stayed there as I watched Arthur and Willow exchange a look I'd seen before years ago when they'd been children caught up in some secret plan. Later that day, Iris stepped quietly into my office, her face more serious than usual. She placed a folder on my desk and then slipped a small flash drive from her purse. "There's something you need to hear, Mrs. Carter. I came across it by accident, Willow, and Arthur met with the lawyer yesterday." She looked uneasy, her eyes searching mine as if she wasn't sure if she'd crossed a line. I hesitated for a moment, but Iris had never brought me trouble for the sake of drama, and I trusted her judgment. I listened to the recording with my hands folded on the desk, trying not to betray any emotion as my daughter's voice filled the room. "We need proof she can't run the company anymore. If we can get medical confirmation, maybe dementia or something, then the board has grounds to take over." Arthur sounded less certain, his tone uneasy. "She's not senile, Willow. She's just old-fashioned. But the lawyer, he says we need evidence to doctor's proper procedure. Otherwise, it'll never work." I stopped the playback and stared out the window. The city looked the same as always, gray and slow-moving, but the air felt different now. I thanked Iris and watched her slip out, closing the door softly behind her. That night, the rain pattered against the windows, the old house, echoing with memories. I set the watch on my bedside table and looked at the ceiling, thinking back over 30 years of early mornings and long nights, every dollar earned and meal delivered. It hurt in a way I couldn't quite describe, knowing that the children I'd raised were already moving the pieces ready to write me out of my own story. The days that followed were marked by an uneasy politeness. Willow scheduled meetings without telling me, bringing Randall along even when his advice wasn't needed. Arthur started spending more time with our accountants, asking for details that seemed innocent at first, until I realized he was building a case, a spreadsheet of my decisions, looking for something to use against me. Iris became my silent support, always alert, letting me know about conversations she overheard, or rumors drifting through the break room. One morning, Iris came in early, coffee in hand, and her voice hushed. "Willow had lunch with Gregory Lancaster yesterday. Janet from accounting saw them at the Blue Oyster, just the two of them. Gregory was chairman of the board, technically my boss, but a friend for years. I had never worried about his loyalty before, but now I wondered if old friendships could withstand what was coming. I spent that afternoon poring over company records, asking myself if I'd missed something obvious. I'd built Haddle Catering from the ground up, and in every report and invoice, I saw the traces of those first hard years, the risks I'd taken, the corners I'd refused to cut. The week stretched out, each day a little more tense than the last. I watched Willow and Arthur moving through the halls, always just a little too busy, always too quick to offer help or advice. At night, I found myself thinking back to the lean years after Tom died, the meals I'd packed in our tiny kitchen, the way Willow used to beg me not to make her deliver food to the neighbors because she was embarrassed. I wondered when pride had turned into resentment and if there'd ever been a chance for things to go differently. The board meeting was set for Tuesday, and on Monday I met with Simon, my lawyer of 2 decades. He sat behind his desk in his tidy office gray suit, crisp pen ready. "You'll need a full medical evaluation," he told me, "and an independent audit of the company. If anyone tries to challenge your ability to lead, you'll have the evidence." He looked at me across the desk, concern in his eyes. "You should consider your will, too. It's time to make sure your wishes are in writing, Evelyn." I nodded, weighing his advice, the memory of Willow's words still ringing in my ears. "You're not immortal, Mom. You can't run things forever." I had always imagined leaving the company to my children, believing they'd respect the work and the values behind it. But now, faced with their impatience, I wasn't sure what would be left standing if I stepped aside. On Tuesday, I arrived at the office before dawn, nerves tight in my chest. I met with accounting, checked every contract, spoke with longtime clients who assured me of their loyalty. Iris handed me a fresh cup of coffee and a list of questions she thought the board might raise. "I'll be right outside if you need me," she said, her voice steady. The boardroom was cool and bright, the long table crowded with familiar faces. Gregory Lancaster called the meeting to order. Willow sat on his right back, straight eyes, bright with a purpose I recognized but no longer understood. Arthur was quiet, flipping through a folder, not meeting my gaze. Willow spoke first, presenting her proposal for a new executive director position. "It's for your own good, Mom," she said, her voice soft but unwavering. "You can't keep up with everything. You've earned a rest." Arthur nodded, adding, "It's time for the next generation to step up." I listened to their words, carefully chosen, and rehearsed each one landing with the weight of inevitability. Gregory outlined the concerns about outdated management techniques, the risks of not modernizing quickly enough. I kept my voice calm as I explained the decisions I'd made: the hospital contracts, the frozen food line, the slow but steady growth. I saw a few board members nodding, but others looked to Willow, waiting to see which way the wind would blow. By the end of the meeting, the decision was delayed, pending further evaluation, but the message was clear. I walked back to my office, the gold watch heavy on my wrist, and closed the door behind me. Iris came in a few minutes later, her presence a quiet reassurance. "You did everything you could, Mrs. Carter," she said. I nodded, the weight of the day pressing in, knowing that nothing would ever be quite the same. That evening, as the sun slipped behind the rooftops and the shadows stretched long across my living room, I sat with the company's old photo albums and wondered how a life's work could start to slip away so quietly. I could hear Tom's voice in my mind, calm and steady as ever, telling me not to give up. Tomorrow would bring another fight, another round of questions and doubts. But for tonight, I let the house grow quiet around me. The next move would be theirs, and I was determined to meet it on my own terms. After the board meeting, I settled into a routine that felt quieter, somehow lonelier than it had in years. The office was the same phones ringing, the low hum of conversation, the smell of coffee drifting from the break room. But I noticed now how Willow avoided my eye in the hallway, how Arthur ducked out of meetings early. There was a careful distance to everything they did, as if they were already rehearsing a future where I wasn't needed. I reviewed every report with extra care, catching small errors that once would have been addressed by my children. The silence between us grew heavier. At home, the quiet was different. I'd sit at the kitchen table with old invoices and family photos laid out side by side. Most evenings, I'd pour a cup of tea and listen to the clock tick down the minutes until bedtime. Tom's chair was still by the window, just as he'd left it, and sometimes I'd rest my hand on its arm and imagine him sitting there, steady and patient, the way he'd always been. I wondered what he'd make of all this, the tension, the secrecy, the feeling that the children we raised together had drifted out of reach. Iris remained a steady presence at the office, her footsteps soft in the hall. Her voice always measured when she brought me the day's updates. She would come in with her notepad, quietly outlining the rumors and moods she'd picked up around the company. "Arthur's asking about account access again," she mentioned one morning as she set a stack of files on my desk. "And Willow has been holding separate meetings with her marketing team. Janet from accounting said there's a lot of talk about changes." I nodded, listening, grateful that someone still felt invested in the work itself, not just the outcome. It wasn't just in the office that I noticed the shift. At family gatherings, the conversation stayed on safe topics, whether school schedules, local news. Willow's daughters smiled politely but barely spoke, and Randall rarely looked up from his phone. Arthur's son Rowan sat beside me one evening and asked if I missed when he was little and always underfoot. I squeezed his hand and told him the truth. "Every single day, honey." The rest of the table went quiet after that, and I realized how much had changed without me noticing. One afternoon, as a storm rolled over Jefferson City, Iris came by with a tray of tea and a plate of lemon cookies. "You haven't eaten since breakfast," she said, settling across from me. I thanked her, the smell of fresh lemon a small comfort. She asked how I was holding up, and I found myself sharing more than I meant to. The worry, the disappointment, the sting of feeling unnecessary. Iris listened, her face thoughtful, and finally said, "It's hard when family forgets what really matters. But you've built something important here, Mrs. Carter. Don't let anyone make you forget that." I nodded, her words sitting with me long after she left the room. The pressure at work only grew. Willow brought in a brochure for a company rebrand, all sleek lines and new slogans, asking me to approve changes that had already been presented to clients. When I hesitated, she accused me of standing in the way. "You built this company for your time, Mom. But now it's our turn," she said, her voice brittle. I told her she needed evidence and research before making such sweeping decisions, but she was already packing up her things, lips pressed in a thin line. Arthur became distant too. He started asking pointed questions about the company's structure, who had access to which contracts were up for renewal. One evening, he dropped by my office and tried to explain. "It's not personal, Mom. We just need to know what the future looks like." I asked him what that meant for me. He couldn't answer. Instead, he mentioned the idea of an outside CEO, someone neutral, someone not bound up in family history. I listened, biting back the urge to remind him of how far we'd come, how many times we'd weathered storms together. I slept less lying awake and replaying conversations, wondering how I'd failed to bridge the gap between business and family. In the early hours, I'd walk the house in slippers, pausing by the photographs lining the hallway, Willow in her cap and gown, Arthur grinning on the day we opened the second kitchen, a younger me holding a tray of sandwiches with pride. I realized I had no real answers, just a growing ache that even in success, you could feel more alone than you ever expected. The worst of it was the way my children's ambitions began to color everything. Every decision, every meeting felt like a test I didn't know I was taking. I heard my name spoken in closed-door meetings, saw my ideas dismissed as old-fashioned, watched my role in the company shift from leader to obstacle in the space of a few months. I felt their eyes on me, waiting for a mistake, waiting for proof that I was too tired, too set in my ways. I clung to the routines that had carried me for decades, arriving early, checking the kitchens myself, listening to the steady rhythm of a place I'd built from nothing. I took small comfort in the staff who greeted me by name, the clients who still called to thank me for a job well done. And always, Iris was nearby, her presence, a gentle reassurance, her loyalty, a quiet reminder that I hadn't lost everything. Still, the isolation settled in, heavy as a winter coat. The people I loved most were the ones pulling away, and I didn't know how to reach them. I watched Willow and Arthur plotting the future, each in their own way, neither willing to let me finish my own story on my terms. Each day felt a little narrower, the world I'd built closing in around me, as if the walls themselves were shrinking. As another board meeting loomed on the calendar, I looked out over the city from my office window, the streets slick with rain and headlights moving slow in the dusk. I promised myself I wouldn't let bitterness take root. There had to be a way to protect what mattered, even if it meant finding strength in solitude. I didn't know how, not yet, but I wasn't ready to give in. Not while there was work left to do. The days ahead would bring decisions I hadn't imagined, making choices about loyalty, about legacy, about who would stand with me when the dust finally settled. For now, I set down my empty teacup and listened to the quiet, bracing myself for whatever the morning would bring. On a Thursday afternoon, the sky was a pale gray, and the air felt damp, the sort of weather that presses you to think a little deeper about everything. Iris stopped by my office just before closing, her jacket still dotted with raindrops. She set a folder on the desk, but instead of her usual brisk update, she paused, shifting her weight from foot to foot. "Do you ever get tired, Mrs. Carter?" she asked, quiet and genuine, as if she'd been carrying the question for days. I leaned back in my chair and let her words hang there, surprised at how much I wanted to answer her honestly. Iris took the chair across from me. For a long moment, the office was filled with the sound of rain tapping the window. She told me about her life in simple terms, her mother gone too soon, her years moving from one foster home to the next, the way she'd learned to keep her belongings in one small bag ready to move at a moment's notice. She described the camp where she first tasted our company's food, the feeling of being, if only for a moment, safe and wanted. "That's why I wanted to work here," she said, her hands folding in her lap. "It's more than a job to me. I remember what it felt like to belong, even if it was just over a warm meal." The words sat with me, reminding me of what I'd hoped to build when I started the business, something sturdy, something that lasted longer than hardship or bad luck. We spoke quietly for nearly an hour, the conversation turning from business to life and back again. For the first time in weeks, I felt seen, not just as a boss or a mother, but as a person who had carried burdens and found small ways to keep going. When the office lights flickered on with the setting sun, I realized I was holding a new kind of hope, a gentle resolve settling somewhere beneath the worry. After Iris left, I called my lawyer Simon and asked to schedule a meeting. I didn't tell him everything, just that it was time to consider some changes. That night, I sat up with a notebook making lists and drawing lines between names, circling the people who'd stood with me when things were hard and underlining the ones who were already looking past me. It was late before I finally closed the book and set it aside, but I knew I'd landed on something I could trust. I met Simon in his office, the building just as familiar as it had been for decades. The walls lined with photos of his family and old baseball trophies. He greeted me warmly, offered coffee, and then listened as I explained what needed to be done. "You're certain about this?" he asked, careful as always. I nodded. "I want Iris to have a real stake, Simon. Not because she asked for it, but because she's earned it in ways the others haven't." He didn't try to change my mind. Instead, he talked me through the process anew with updated paperwork, clear instructions that would stand up even if Willow or Arthur decided to contest them. "We'll bring in witnesses," he said, "and a doctor if needed. I want this to be airtight." I agreed, grateful for his thoroughness, for the comfort of old routines. The next days moved with purpose. I gathered financial reports, reached out to longtime clients, and reviewed every detail of the company's performance. Iris, unaware of my plan, continued her work with steady attention, sometimes pausing in the doorway to ask if I needed anything. I noticed how she greeted everyone in the halls by name, remembered birthdays and small preferences, never seeking recognition, but always making sure the business felt human. As the date for signing the new documents approached, I slept easier. There were still hard moments, meals eaten in silence, meetings where Willow's tone grew sharper and Arthur's glances skated away from mine. But I felt a shift inside, the slow turning of something that had been stuck for too long. On a Sunday morning, I brewed coffee and watched the sunrise from my porch, the first real peace I'd felt in months. The day I signed the new will, Simon had arranged everything. The notary was a woman with gentle hands and a calm voice. The doctor asked me a series of questions, confirming my memory and my intentions. I signed my name with a steady hand, feeling the weight of every decision that had led me to that moment. Simon sealed the papers and placed them in his safe. "It's done," he said, and for the first time in a long while, I felt in control. I left his office and walked through the city, letting the noise and movement of Jefferson City fill my head. It was as if every step made things a little clearer. I thought about Tom and what he would say about the early years when we'd struggled to buy groceries, about Willow's first birthday, and Arthur's laugh as a little boy. I knew there would be fallout, but I felt steadier than I had in weeks. Iris would have a real place in what I'd built, something to keep it rooted when I was gone. At home that night, I set a single lamp on in the living room and sat with a cup of tea listening to the house settle around me. The feeling wasn't triumph, just a kind of quiet certainty. I was ready for whatever came next, ready to face my children and explain my reasons no matter how they might take it. I fell asleep that night knowing I'd made a choice I could live with. Morning would bring a new round of challenges, conversations that couldn't be put off, decisions that couldn't be undone. But for the first time in a long time, I felt that the company's future and my own story were right where they needed to be. And so, as the next week began, I gathered my strength for what was coming, knowing that the hardest part might be telling Willow and Arthur that the legacy they'd taken for granted would look different than they'd planned. The first Monday after signing the new will, I arrived at the office before the sun crested the river. The building was silent, the city's morning traffic just beginning to stir outside. I stood in my own doorway a little longer than usual, letting the weight of what I'd done settle in. Iris was already at her desk with a stack of files, focused, her eyes tired but determined. She looked up and gave me a small, steady smile as I passed by. Throughout that week, I began including Iris in meetings I used to handle on my own, client negotiations, supplier calls, even a review with the kitchen staff about our fall menu. At first, she took notes quietly, asking questions only when something wasn't clear. But it didn't take long before she started offering suggestions, seeing angles I'd missed, thinking about problems in ways that felt familiar, and yet entirely her own. I watched the other managers begin to notice her, the way she listened, the way she didn't need the spotlight, but still seemed to guide conversations back to what mattered. On Thursday afternoon, I asked Iris to sit in on a meeting with the private clinic group, one of our oldest and most demanding clients. She hesitated at the door, smoothing her skirt, but I nodded for her to come in. "You're ready," I told her quietly as we took our seats. She watched the first round of negotiations, writing down every detail. When the discussion grew tense over pricing, she leaned forward and calmly explained our new sourcing process, how it would benefit both sides if they gave us more notice on their orders. There was a moment of silence, then the client agreed. I caught her eye and gave the smallest nod, knowing she understood what that meant. Word spread quickly through the office. Willow cornered me in the hallway, her voice sharp. "Why is she involved in everything all of a sudden? Arthur and I are supposed to be learning those things, not her." I told her I was expanding everyone's responsibilities, that the company's future depended on more than just titles. She didn't like that answer, and I could see it in the way she stormed off, shoulders tight. Arthur was quieter about it, but he started avoiding Iris, speaking to her only when necessary, his tone stiff. By Friday, the undercurrent in the office was impossible to ignore. Reports were late, meetings skipped. I caught snippets of conversations, someone whispering about the new favorite, another person wondering if Willow and Arthur were being pushed out. I met Iris in the break room that afternoon and found her staring at her phone, hands trembling just slightly. "It's a lot to take in," she admitted, "but I'll do my best." "Mrs. Carter." I squeezed her shoulder. "That's all I ever ask." The next weekend, I invited the family to dinner at my house. I hoped a little food and time together might soften some of the tension, maybe help Willow and Arthur see Iris as more than a threat. I set the table with my best dishes, ordered supper from the Italian place Willow liked, and made sure to have Rowan's favorite pie for dessert. Willow arrived first, Randall in tow, but her daughters stayed home, supposedly with homework. Arthur brought Rowan, who greeted me with a hug and quickly disappeared to the den with his phone. Iris arrived last, wearing a plain navy dress and a nervous smile. The meal started out civil enough, small talk about the weather, Willow's new yoga class, the city's plans to repave Main Street. But after the second glass of wine, Randall leaned across the table and said, "So Iris, how does it feel to be getting all the insider knowledge? Pretty convenient timing, don't you think?" The room went still. Willow shot Randall a look but said nothing. Arthur busied himself with his fork. Iris glanced at me unsure, so I answered for her. Iris is learning the ropes because she's earned my trust. She's helped save contracts and smooth out more than a few storms these last few years. That's why she's here. Randall snorted, and Rowan looked up curious. Why aren't Aunt Willow and Dad going to run the company after you? Grandma? He asked, voice as clear as a bell in the quiet. The room seemed to freeze. I met Rowan's gaze and told him the truth. Because running a company is a responsibility, not just a right. It takes more than a last name. Willow's cheeks flushed, her jaw set. That's not what you always said, Mom. You always told us this was for us, for the family. Arthur stayed silent, staring at his plate. Randall let out a short laugh. Maybe the plans changed, Will. Maybe you should start looking for another gig. The conversation faltered after that. Willow barely touched her food and Randall kept pouring himself wine. Rowan tried to talk about his soccer season, but even he could feel the air had shifted. After dessert, Willow pulled me aside in the hallway. Her voice shook. You're pushing us out for someone you barely know. Why are you doing this? I answered her as gently as I could, reminding her that I had always wanted her and Arthur to succeed, but that wanting and trusting were not always the same thing. She shook her head, tears in her eyes, and walked away. The house felt colder after everyone left. Iris lingered in the kitchen, helping me gather plates. I didn't mean to cause trouble, she said, quietly, setting the silverware in the sink. I told her trouble had started long before she ever came along. When the last light was off and the house had settled into its late-night stillness, I sat by the window and watched the street outside empty, but for a few headlights passing by. It struck me that the first real step had been taken. There was no turning back now, not for any of us. Tomorrow, there would be more questions, more tension. But for the first time in a while, I felt a kind of resolve settle over me like a steady hand on my shoulder. Sunday morning broke cold and clear, the kind of day where even the light felt sharper. I was up before dawn, standing at the kitchen counter, with my coffee running through what needed to be said. I set out plates and glasses for the family meeting, keeping my hands busy, while my mind tried to steady itself. I thought about every step that had brought me here, about the choices, the disappointments, the long hours, and the quiet rooms that followed. By the time the clock struck noon, everything was ready except my heart. Willow and Randall arrived first. Willow moving with a briskness that almost dared me to meet her eye. She wore her favorite navy blazer, her face carefully composed, but I could see the tightness in her jaw. Randall hung back silent and watchful. Arthur showed up 10 minutes later with Rowan, his suit jacket rumpled, his eyes uncertain. Rowan gave me a quick hug before settling in the corner with his phone. Iris was last dressed in a simple blue dress, her hair pulled back, hands folded in her lap, as she took a seat at the edge of the room. We gathered in the living room, the air heavy with what was unsaid. I stood by the fireplace and looked at each of them. I've called you all here, I began, because I've made a decision about the future of the company and our family. Willow leaned forward, her lips pressed in a line. Arthur sat back, arms crossed. Iris looked down, tracing the rim of her teacup with her thumb. I explained that a month ago, after a lot of thought and more than a few sleepless nights, I'd changed my will. There was a pause so quiet I could hear the ticking of the mantel clock. When my time comes, the controlling interest in Carter Catering 60% will go to Iris. My voice was calm. I could feel all their eyes on me. Willow, Arthur, you'll each receive 15%. Rowan, you'll have a share, and so will a charity fund for children who need a hand up. The words hit like a stone thrown into a pond. Willow's face went white, then red, her voice trembling when she spoke. Is this a joke? You can't do that. I met her gaze. I can, and I have. The documents are in order with witnesses with a doctor's evaluation. It's final. Randall started in talking about lawsuits about rights, but I held up my hand. There's nothing you can do to change this, Randall. I've made my decision. Arthur just looked at me, his face drawn. Why, Mom? After everything, I kept my answer simple. Because Iris has earned it. She understands what this company is, what it means to the people who depend on it. She's not interested in quick profit or selling out. Willow let out a shaky laugh, then turned on Iris. Congratulations, you've managed to take everything. Iris answered quietly. I didn't ask for this. I only want to do right by the company. Willow shook her head, fighting back tears. It should be ours. You always said you were building this for us. I nodded, holding her gaze. I hoped you'd be ready for it, but your vision isn't the company's future, not the way I see it. Arthur rose, his hands balled into fists, but he didn't shout. I just want you to know you've hurt us, Mom. This will change everything. I nodded. I know, but sometimes doing what's right means not everyone is happy. He didn't answer, just turned and walked out. Rowan trailed behind, stopping long enough to say, I'll see you at the office. Grandma. His voice soft, but steady. Willow lingered for a moment, eyes shining with anger. I hope you're happy, Mom. You've chosen her over your own children. I didn't answer, and after a beat, she left Randall close behind. The house was quiet again, the sound of the door closing echoing down the hallway. Iris stayed seated, hands folded tight, her face pale. I never wanted to come between you and your family, she said quietly. I sat beside her, feeling the weight of it all. This isn't your fault. I made this choice because I know you'll do right by what I built. It's not about blood, it's about trust. She nodded, tears in her eyes. I promise I won't let you down. That afternoon, the sun moved slowly across the living room, throwing long stripes of light onto the rug. I sat there with Iris, the silence between us peaceful in its own way. I knew the storm wasn't over. There would be more hurt, more words left unsaid, maybe even legal battles. But I also knew the time for waiting was past. I had chosen my path, and now all that was left was to walk it. The next day, at the office, I noticed the shift. Willow's office door stayed closed. Arthur's laughter no longer drifted down the hall. A few employees whispered in the break room, but most carried on steady and kind as always. Iris met my eye across the conference table, her confidence growing with each passing day. The company would go on, and so would I. There was still one more conversation to be had, a final act that would bring this long struggle to its close. But for now, I let myself sit with the quiet feeling, the courage it took to choose my own ending. That next morning, sunlight filtered in through my kitchen window, painting gold stripes on the floor. I poured a cup of coffee and stood by the sink, listening to the house settle. There was no going back now. Willow and Arthur had left yesterday, still wounded, their absence echoing in every quiet corner. I set my mug down, took a slow breath, and told myself to move forward. There was work to do. There always was, even after a storm. At the office, the air felt charged. People glanced up from their screens as I walked in, but nobody said much. Willow's door stayed closed, her nameplate catching the morning light. Arthur's voice was missing from the usual Monday chatter. I nodded to Iris as she passed in the hallway, her hands full of reports and her eyes a little brighter than before. She stopped by my office after lunch, hovering in the doorway, uncertain. Do you want me to handle the hospital contract call? She asked. I nodded. You're ready for it. She smiled, the kind of smile that said she finally believed it herself. That week, the work moved ahead, though it wasn't the same. Willow sent formal emails signing her name with a cool flourish. Arthur came and went quiet and distracted, barely looking me in the eye. Randall, Willow's husband, started dropping hints in the break room about consulting opportunities elsewhere. It became clear that my children were preparing to step away, even if they weren't ready to say it outright. Rowan, though, surprised me. He started coming by after school, asking questions about our clients, and shadowing Iris in the afternoons. I found him one evening in the conference room, looking over sales reports. "I think I'd like to work here someday, Grandma," he said. Not shy about it. "Maybe I could learn from both you and Iris." I smiled, feeling something settle in my chest. "You're always welcome, Rowan. Just remember, this place runs on hard work and kindness. That's what matters most." Word soon spread that changes were coming. A few longtime employees pulled me aside, voicing their worries about the future. "Are we being sold?" one of the cooks asked. "Is Willow going to take her clients and leave?" I assured them that the company would remain as it had always been, steady, local, focused on people first. "Nothing important is changing," I told them. "Not the things that matter." That seemed to calm them, at least for now. The legal threats arrived that Thursday, an envelope hand-delivered from Randall's office. It was full of sharp words about undue influence, inheritance rights, and promises to contest my new will in court. I took the letter to Simon, my lawyer, and watched as he read it over with a slow, steady patience. "They can try Marjorie," he said, "but your case is strong. You have the records, the witnesses, the medical evaluations. It won't be easy for them." I nodded, grateful for his calm. "Let's do what we need to do," I told him. "Let's make sure it stands." That evening, as I left the office, Iris was waiting by the door. She hesitated before speaking. "Mrs. Carter, are you sure about all of this?" I could see the worry in her face, the weight of what I'd placed on her shoulders. "I'm sure," I answered, meeting her gaze. "This company needs someone who cares for it the way I always have. That's you." She nodded, taking it in. The next week brought more changes. Willow submitted her resignation, formal, crisp, with barely a word to me beyond what was required. She packed her things one afternoon, moving swiftly through the halls. I watched her go, feeling the ache that only a mother can know. Arthur stayed, at least for now, though the distance between us grew. He did his work, made no trouble, but the warmth we'd once shared seemed lost. Still, I greeted him each morning, hoping some small bridge might remain. For a while, it felt as if the company held its breath, waiting to see if the ground beneath us would shift. But business carried on. Clients renewed contracts, the kitchen buzzed with the usual energy, and the familiar smells of bread and soup drifted through the halls. Iris stepped further into her new role, organizing meetings, fielding calls, making decisions with care and thoughtfulness. Some staff were wary, some were quietly supportive, but most seemed to trust my choice. One afternoon, I took Rowan out for lunch at a small diner a few blocks from the office. We sat in a booth by the window, watching cars drift by. "Are you okay, Grandma?" he asked, his eyes searching mine. "I am, sweetheart. Change isn't easy, but it's necessary. I hope one day you'll understand." He nodded, serious for someone so young. "I just want you to be happy." I reached for his hand and squeezed it, grateful for his gentle heart. By the end of that week, I felt something new, a sense that the worst of the storm had passed. The house was quieter. The office felt different, but beneath all of it, there was a current of hope. I knew Willow and Arthur would need time and maybe distance to make peace with what had happened. I left the door open for them both, literally and in my heart. Iris flourished with each new responsibility, her confidence growing, her respect among the staff deepening every day. One evening, as the sun set behind the rooftops of Jefferson City, I watched Iris leading a team meeting in the main conference room. Her voice was steady, her answers clear. I saw the faces around the table, old friends, new hires, People who had trusted me for years listening to her with the same attention they once gave me. I felt pride, quiet, and sure that I had chosen well. Still, I knew there was one more thing to do, a way to bring true closure, not just for myself, but for my family and for Iris. As I locked up the office that night, I told myself tomorrow would be for new beginnings and for finally putting the past to rest. When I look back now, I see the quiet changes, first the small shifts that only become clear when the noise fades. The office felt different after Willow left. Her absence left a space no one rushed to fill, and for a time, I let myself grieve the daughter I loved and the dreams I'd once held for us. Arthur kept his distance, doing his work with a steady, muted presence, careful and polite. Sometimes he'd bring Rowan by, and the boy's gentle curiosity was a reminder that even in loss, something hopeful could grow. I gave Iris more room, slowly showing her the heart of the company, the people, the stories behind every recipe, the care that went into each detail. She listened, she learned, and she never once treated any of it as a prize to be claimed, but as a trust to be honored. One evening, a few months after everything changed, Arthur stopped by my house with Rowan. He stood at the threshold, awkward, not sure whether to come in or turn away. I invited them in, made tea, set out a plate of cookies, just like I used to when the kids were small. Arthur looked older, worn at the edges, but there was something softer in his voice. He didn't say much about the past, only that he understood now why I made the decisions I did. Rowan, sitting quietly beside him, asked if he could help out at the company over the summer. I agreed, and in that moment, I felt the heaviness begin to lift just a little. Sometimes you have to let go of what you thought you wanted so you can hold on to what truly matters. Iris stepped fully into her new role over the next year, earning the trust of the staff, the clients, and even the last few board members who had doubted her at first. She came to me sometimes late in the day, asking for advice, or just to sit together in the quiet of my office. More often, though, I found myself watching her from a distance, her steady hand, her care for people, her respect for the work. The company grew not in ways that made the front page or caught headlines, but in the way that mattered, with honesty, with dignity, with heart. The house feels peaceful now, filled with old memories and new ones being made. Holidays are smaller, but somehow more genuine. Willow hasn't reached out, not yet, but I keep hoping. My door stays open. Life is quieter, but not empty. There's a freedom in having survived the storm and come through with my values intact. Looking back, I see that true justice isn't always loud or dramatic. Sometimes it's the quiet choice to hold firm to what you know is right, even when it costs you. Sometimes it's trusting the next generation, even if they don't share your name. I've learned that dignity comes from refusing to let bitterness take root, and that resilience means loving what you've built enough to protect it, no matter how lonely that fight might feel. If you've listened this far, I hope you'll remember what matters most isn't how much you hold on to, but how much you give and the kindness you leave behind. Thank you for sharing this time with me. If this story meant something to you, I'd love to hear your thoughts or your own stories of quiet courage. And if you'd like to join me again, you know where to find me.